Today's presentation is Gardening Questions Answered, Pests of Ornamentals. My name is Susan Njai, and I'm the Community Horticulture Educator and Head of the Master Gardener Volunteer Program. And today we have with me Betty Hill, who is a brand new Master Gardener Volunteer, as well as Mary Pavadinsky, who's also a brand new volunteer. Before we get into our pests, I just wanted to do a disclaimer about pesticides. We will be giving some pesticide recommendations today, and every effort has been made to provide correct, complete, and up-to-date pesticide recommendations. Nevertheless, changes in pesticide regulations occur constantly and human errors are still possible. These recommendations are not a substitute for pesticide labeling. Please read the label before applying any pesticide. The information given herein is supplied with the understanding that no discrimination is intended and no endorsement by Cornell Cooperative Extension is implied. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Betty, and she's going to talk about some pests.
One of our Ask the Master Gardener questions that had come in was, in late summer, I always find bright yellow aphids all over my milkweed. What can I do to prevent this? And I have the same problem on my echinacea. So first of all, you need to know what they look like. And they're small oval-shaped bugs with cornicles at the back. And the cornicles are those two things that look like exhaust pipes. And they are winged or wingless. So you've got your choice. So as you start to look at your plants, you're looking for large colonies. You might see some shoot dieback. And then you'll notice the aphids on the plant, or some leaf distortion. Some of the plants will have a cottony buildup, this white fuzz that you see, and they attract ants. The ants are kind of harmless, except people don't tend to like ants crawling on their plants. This is what you'll look for when you're looking at problems in your garden. So there's different ways to handle it. Cultural or physical management would be to remove the top growth before the plant emerges in the spring. So if you haven't done a fall cleanup in the spring, take off the old dead leaves. One of your best friends is a forceful jet of water. If you just spray the plants on a regular basis, the stems or wherever you're finding the aphids, it really helps the problem. And another thing is, don't over fertilize. Aphids are attracted to plants with higher nitrogen content, so you don't really want to be overfeeding the plants. And then we have some biological management, and you're going to find that lady beetles and lacewings tend to be your friend as far as controlling some of these pests. And syrphid larvae and parasitoidal wasps are also helpful in controlling the aphids. There's some low-risk chemicals, and one of them is the horticultural oil, and the other is insecticidal soaps. And you can use these things, but it's really important to get them on the bug. Watch your spraying and make sure that you're actually hitting the aphids. And the next question was, why are my holly leaves turning black? And the problem is you have a scale infestation. And it's pretty sad looking, but there's two kinds of scale. One are soft scale. So these are tiny bugs, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch long. They feed on the sap in the phloem, and they excrete lots of honeydew. So you're going to get the gooky, sticky stuff dripping, and they're found on the leaves or the bark. The other type of scale is armored scale. These are even smaller, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch long, and they feed on the contents of the individual cells. They don't produce honeydew, but they're also found on the leaves and the bark. The symptoms are, they come in large colonies, so you'll see a bunch of them, like little bumps on the stems, or leaf yellowing. You'll see stunted growth on some of the plants, or dieback, or sooty mold, so it looks like a white powdery substance on your plants. The most important cultural management technique is to have the right plant in the right place, and that's probably true of all gardening. And then in this case, not to over fertilize. You're not being friendly to your plants if you feed them too much. That strong spray of water is also helpful in this case, and a soft scrub brush so you can kind of break the seal on the scale and take them away. Pruning heavily infested branches or branches that show dieback are important, because you get it out of your garden. And the hardest thing to do is to remove the plants or protect others. We tend to want to save everything, but in this case, getting rid of a plant that's not a tremendously valuable plant is probably the best effort. Again, your biological friends, the lady beetles and the lacewings and the larvae and the wasps, are helpful in getting rid of this kind of pest. Low-risk chemicals can be used, but timing is most important here, because you want to get them taken care of before the protective shell forms. So you could use horticultural oil during the crawler stage, which is a pretty short opportunity. Mid to late winter, you can go over wintering scale with a dormant oil. But both of those, the timing is important. If you do it at the wrong time, it really doesn't have any impact. And for large trees, the best thing is to hire a professional. It's not something you probably could handle by yourself. And the third one that I'm going to talk about is spider mites. So one of our questions was, last year I had spider mites on several of my plants in the garden. I thought they were only a pest on household plants, and they are not. They feed on hundreds of plants and thrive during the hot, dry summers. And last year was a hot summer, so you probably saw a lot of spider mites. You have to know what a 12-point font period is, but these are half the size of that, so obviously very tiny. They have 8 legs. They have a sucking, piercing mouth part. The most common one is the 2-spotted spider mite, which is what's pictured below. You'll find them on the underside of leaves and stippling on the leaves. So they're pretty apparent, forming this pattern on the bottom of the leaves. You'll see some webbing and distorted leaves as well. And this is a case of you don't want your plants to dry out because remember you're dealing with heat. So you want to water the plants regularly. You want to check your garden, especially in a hot summer, looking for them and looking for that discoloration on the leaves. It's important to look under the leaves. And you can, again, remove by using a high pressure spray. Your lady beetles and your predatory mites are helpful here. And in this case, direct contact has to be made. They're protected by webbing. So you want to make sure you get under that webbing and use your horticultural oil, your insecticidal soap, but you make sure you get in the mites.
All right, thank you so much, Betty. And now we're going to turn it over to Mary, and Mary's going to tell us about some more pests of ornamentals. So take it away, Mary.
The leaves of my Andromeda are severely discolored. Is this some kind of disease? It's a question that we got, and not a disease. This looks more like damage from a severe lace bug infestation. Usually you do not see the actual lace bugs because lace bugs spend their whole lives on the undersides of the leaves. They're tiny too. They're about 1/8 inch to 1/3 of an inch long as adults. And this picture shows what they look like very close up, but usually you just see sort of a little white blob, a lot of little tiny nymphs that look more like miniature sea urchins because they're very spiny. And sometimes you'll see black eggs. All of these things will be living underneath the leaves, and they're very specific to the species. There's a different kind of lace bug that likes to live on Andromeda, a different one for azalea, oaks, sycamores. The ones that live on trees, usually the trees are large enough so that they just tolerate the bug's presence, but you will see a little stippling on the leaves sometimes. But if you've got a bad infestation, you need to look under the leaves and see what's going on there. You'll see the adults, nymphs, and the black eggs underneath the leaves. On the top, you'll see small whitish spots. And when there get to be a lot of them for a major infestation, there'll be severe leaf discoloration and the leaves start dropping early. So it can really be damaging to a plant if you have a lot of this going on. Best thing that you can do with all of these is monitor the plants. Take a walk around every day, see what's going on with the plants. For one thing, it's enjoyable to walk around there, but also look under leaves if you see something funny going on the top. Look on the top of the leaf for damage. If you see a lot of leaves on plants that are a different color than they should be. And then the first thing that you should always try to resort to for bugs of any kind is knock them off with a water spray. With lace bugs, it's pretty easy. You just go around with a hose. If you have something really strong, like a spray bottle that really has some power to it, you can just knock off the nymphs and eggs with a water spray and problems should be solved as long as you keep doing this. There are also, fortunately, a lot of things that like to eat lace bugs. Assassin bugs, lady beetles, lacewings are all really great predators, particularly for these kinds of infestations. You might want to take a look at what assassin bugs and lacewings look like in case you haven't seen them before. So if you see those things underneath the leaf, let them do their job. Infestations will usually attract predators, so you don't have to buy them and bring them in, although you can buy some of these. You probably won't need to do that. The predators will just show up. Management can include low-risk chemicals if you hit the underside of the leaves. But again, as Betty said, they have to come in direct contact with the insects. So you're better off trying to wash them off with water first and use horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps as a last resort. Yes, you can use persistent and systemic insecticides, but we really don't recommend it except for super severe infestations. They can only work or be used after flowering. Frankly, you're better off sometimes just getting rid of the plant or isolating it until the problem is taken care of. Next, we have iris borers. And yes, they look like awful pinkish worms eating the iris roots. And what you do depends on how bad it is. First, here's what they look like. The eggs are tiny and they overwinter in the plant debris, so you're not really going to see them, but getting rid of the plant debris is always a good idea. They look like pink grub-like larvae. You hardly ever will see the actual moth that they hatch into. They're kind of nondescript, brownish gray. They look like most of the moths you see attracted to light. So the pink grub is what you're going to mostly see. Symptoms are going to be obvious as long as you're looking for them. Brown leaf tips, that's early in the spring. They start getting brown. Later on, you'll see tunnels going from the top down the leaf as grubs chew their way down toward the roots or the rhizomes. You'll see dead leaves and pinkish larvae near or in the rhizomes. That's where they're heading for. After things get really bad, you'll smell it even before you see it, and the rhizomes will be rotting, and it's pretty awful. By that time, about all you can do is pull them up and start again. There are some management things you can do. One of them is to try to select more tolerant iris varieties like the Siberian iris. They're not as attractive to these moths and borers, but if you're really dead set on bearded iris, which I always have been, you have to remember to remove all the old leaves and stalks in the fall after the hard frost. And starting early in the spring, walk around and crush or remove any eggs and larvae that you see, and immediately remove any rotten or damaged rhizomes. If you see the critters in there eating, it's probably too late to save, but at least pull them out of there and get them isolated so that you can deal with them. There are some biological things that will help, and one of them is nematodes. You can order these online. You can get them they come in a little sachet-like thing, and they are roundworms, but you probably won't ever actually see them. They're so tiny and they're underground, but they will infect the grubs, the larvae, and kill off a lot of them. You still need to keep monitoring them because even when some are killed, there'll be others out there. There are chemical things that you can do. Again, monitor it in the spring, but apply only if you see the eggs and the larvae, and timing is very important. You have to apply it just as the eggs hatch. Here is one of my least favorite creatures. How do I get rid of the red beetles destroying my lilies? Oh, what do they look like? Usually the first thing you see is the bright red adults because they make no show of hiding. They're all over the place. The eggs you'll see underneath the leaves, and they're bright red when they're about to hatch. The worst part, though, is the larvae, which cover themselves with their own poop as a disguise. If they weren't disgusting enough already, okay, let's go to the next one. You'll see symptoms very quickly. Leaf holes, skeletonization. The only thing left of a leaf is just the veins. Damage to flower buds, and the death of heavily infested plants. And it does not take long for them to go crazy and totally destroy a plant. They even get down into the bulbs. You can monitor for and handpick adults in the spring and scrape off the eggs and larvae. And again, this should be sort of a daily routine. Go out there with a cup of soapy water, hold it underneath the stem or the leaf that the adult is sitting on, because instinctively, if they're disturbed, they're going to drop straight down. And if you've got a cup of soapy water right under them, you're going to get a lot of them that way. You have to scrape off the eggs and larvae, but don't just dump them on the ground because they can reemerge, or if they're old enough, they can pupate down under the soil from where they are. There is, fortunately, biological wasps that will take care of some of this as they become established, we hope. There are 3 kinds of parasitoid wasps, and you can see them here. They're burrowing into the larvae and laying their eggs, which will emerge and feed on the larvae at the same time. I think they're getting more established in New York State from the literature I've been reading. So there is hope, but in the meantime, you have to walk around and just kill them. There are some chemicals that can be applied. They only affect the young larvae, and they have to be applied every 5 to 7 days. Neem oil is a good one, but again, as with any chemical, it's going to kill every kind of insect that comes in contact, including the little parasitoid wasps. So you really should stick to monitoring, even if you have to try other things.
All right, thank you so much, Mary.
Thank you.
And now I'm going to tell you about 3 more pests before we finish up. This is a really common question that we get. What are the pinecone-esque things hanging off my cedar tree? So if you've never seen any of these before, these are bagworms. And here is the creature coming out of it. This one's feeding on a stem of grass, but they're these little caterpillars. And what they do is they cover themselves with a silken bag, very fancy, and they attach to that bag whatever it is that they're eating. So here we have one on a spruce tree. So you can see all of the spruce needles that have been attached to it. So it's really a form of camouflage and also a form of protection. It's really hard. The silken bags are extremely difficult to tear into. So it's really protecting itself from predators. So what are you going to see? Well, if you have a broadleaf plant, you're going to see holes in the leaves. They're caterpillars, so they're munching away. If you have a conifer, such as this poor tree here, it's going to defoliate, right? Their mouth parts are going to basically eat all of the needles that are there. And especially in conifers, heavy infection can cause the death. I've seen quite a few really heavily infested spruce trees and arborvitaes right here in Orange County in Middletown that are they're done. Now, luckily with broadleaf plants, they will put out new leaves. And if it's late enough in the season, it doesn't affect them nearly as much because they'll put new leaves out in the next year. But with conifers, that's what you really need to keep an eye on. Interestingly, the eggs overwinter in their bags. What you really want to do is in the spring is remove all those bags. And so if you have a small shrub or a small tree, you can do that manually. You can still do it now. They don't come out until later. So yeah, if you want to go and look at all of your conifers, your spruce, your arborvitae, your red cedar, go in and pick all those bags off of them. Now, management using biological spray called Bacillus thuringiensis or BT can be used, but it has to be applied right after egg hatch. Once they get too big, it no longer has any effect on them. So timing is really important. And that's the same thing with other chemical controls. It's most effective right after egg hatch. So when do the eggs hatch? Well, it's really weather dependent, temperature dependent. So usually it's between late May and mid-June. But luckily there's an organization out there called the National Phenology Network, and they actually track the temperatures and they know exactly when they're going to come out. So if you go to their website, you can actually have them email you, and they'll email you 2 weeks ahead of time. They'll say, bagworms will be emerging in 2 weeks, and then they'll email you and they'll say bagworms are going to come out in 6 days. So you can be really ready. If you have bagworms and you're planning on treating them with BT or with another chemical, you can be ready for their emergence. Because if you wait too long, it's not going to have any effect. So now we'll move on to another favorite, Japanese beetles. So how do you get rid of Japanese beetles? They're destroying my roses. So here are some heavily infested rose blooms, which is a very common sight. Japanese beetles love roses. So you're probably pretty familiar with what they look like, but they overwinter underground as grubs, white grubs, and they actually can be a pest on lawns. And then the beetles emerge usually around early summer, usually around late June. They're largest beetles, and they have that really metallic wing coating and that green head and thorax. So what kind of damage you're gonna see? Well, it depends on the plant. They'll skeletonize leaves, leaving just the veins. They'll just destroy blooms, especially roses and zinnias. They like peaches and raspberries. And they'll also can cause extensive defoliation. This is a little leaf linden tree that was extensive defoliated. Now, luckily, if it's early enough in the season, it'll put new leaves out, but continual defoliation really stresses a tree out. So it can cause a lot of issues, especially if it's a small, not well-established tree. So what can we do? Well, one thing you can do is plant a trap crop. So a trap crop is something that you plant that you're planting purposely to attract a pest. Japanese beetles, like most insects, have a preference. They feed on a lot of different things, but they definitely really like roses. They really like hops. And so if you have something that they're more interested in, they will eat that before they go after whatever your prized thing is. So you can kind of experiment. See, what's important with the trap crop is you're trapping them, but then you also have to take care of them, whether you're going to use insecticide or whether you're going to take them all off of that plant, kind of just have them all in one spot. But you have to make sure you take care, because once they decimate that crop, they're going to move on to whatever it is that you didn't want them on in the first place. If you're planting new plants, there are things that they don't like. So think about what you can plant that they're not going to eat if they're a big problem in your area. Here we have an example of someone who's handpicking them. Just as Mary was saying with the lily leaf beetles, they fall down. So you want to put your cup of water right under them so that they fall into that cup. And the best times to do that is at dawn or dusk. That's when they're least active. And so that's when they're, sitting in one spot eating your plant. And then also you can use some exclusion netting. So this is a small tree. So if this was defoliated, it would probably kill the tree. So if you have some small trees and the Japanese beetles like them, it's highly recommended that you put some netting around them to protect them. Traps are really abundant, and everyone's always telling me about how they get these traps, and they collect hundreds and thousands of beetles, but it is not recommended that you use traps. Do not use them unless you purposely want to collect them for whatever it is. I happen to collect them so that we use them for educational purposes. But what happens is the trap will actually attract more beetles to your property than you would have had if you didn't have the trap. And the beetles don't fly directly to the trap. They kind of get sidetracked, like, oh, I smell a rose, and they go on your roses, or I smell some raspberries, and they go on your raspberries. So by putting up a trap, you're just having more beetles come onto your property. Yes, you'll catch a lot of them, but a lot of them will also go to other plants. So it is not recommended that you use these traps. So there are some options for biological control for Japanese beetle grubs in turf grass. Unfortunately, that's unlikely to reduce the population of Japanese beetles on your landscape because they fly. So it's not like they come out of your grass and they crawl onto your plants. So if you get rid of them in your grass, you're going to get rid of them on your plants. You can treat your grass if you have a grub issue, and I would only treat it if you know you have a grub issue. And we'll talk about that at our lawn care class in August. Just treating your lawn is not going to get rid of the ones that are feeding on your roses or your blueberries. Chemical control, there are chemical controls out there, but they're usually not recommended for home gardeners because beetles are really hard to kill. You usually have to use something that's systemic. Systemic things, it also affects the flowers. So if it's a flowering plant, it will also harm pollinators. So you have to wait until after pollination occurs. Beetles are just really tough. They're really hard and it's really hard to kill them. So we don't recommend chemical control. Right, so let's move on to another pest. These here are sawflies. So what kind of caterpillar is this eating my dogwood? Well, in fact, it isn't a caterpillar. As I said, it's a sawfly. It's okay. You're saying, what are sawflies? So sawflies are closely related to ants, bees, and wasps. So here they are. These are red pine sawfly larvae. And then here's the adult. It kind of looks like a bee or a wasp. One of the big distinctions is it doesn't have a waist. Wasps all have waists. You know, there's a really skinny part, and sawflies are thick all the way down. So that's an adult, although you rarely see adult. So how do you know it's a sawfly, not a caterpillar? Well, it has to do with the number of legs that it has. So if you look here on the left, this is a red-headed pine sawfly larvae, and it has 3 thoracic legs. Those are the legs that will become the legs when it becomes an adult. Then it has 7 prolegs, and then 1 pair of anal prolegs. And that number 7 is really important. Because if we look over here on the right at the zebra caterpillar, it has the same 3 thoracic legs. Those are going to be the legs when it becomes butterfly. And then we have 4 abdominal prolegs, and then we have the anal prolegs. So sawflies always have more than 5 pairs of prolegs. So if it's more than the number of fingers on your hand, it's a sawfly. So here's another example. This is a dogwood sawfly. And then this is our, monarch butterfly caterpillar. So the monarch has 4 of those abdominal prolegs. And then the dogwood sawfly larvae has 7. How can you tell it's a sawfly besides the legs? Well, they're smooth with little or no hair. So if you see something that's furry and hairy, it's not going to be a sawfly. They also are pretty small. They usually don't get more than 1 inch long. And they often feed gregariously. So there's usually large clumps of them. There are some caterpillars that feed, like tent caterpillars, but these are usually in large clumps. There's also usually 1 generation per year. So you're going to see them at the same time every year and only at that time. And they only stick around for a couple weeks. So what kind of damage you're going to see? So here we have on the left, that's a dogwood sawfly. You can see the creatures, they're doing a number on those leaves. That's pretty common here in Orange County. The middle picture is of roses. This is becoming more and more common here in Orange County. We get several calls of that every year. So we can cause some pretty good defoliation roses. And then here on the right is one of the pine sawflies. There's 6 species of pine sawfly here in New York State. So you can see once again, deciduous trees and with broadleaf, the damage is less dire because, they'll grow back or put their leaves back out. But with the conifer, once those pine needles are gone, once those needles are gone, it's pretty much it. So it can be especially devastating on those. So what are you going to do? Well, once again, we highly recommend you going out there and removing them by hand. Now, these are sometimes found in large trees. So maybe if they're really heavily infested because they're all kind of clumped together, pruning out some of those heavily infested branches, or just spraying them off, right? They're walking around, so they're not going to fly back up in the tree. So you can spray them off with a high pressure water spray. So luckily they're eaten by lots of things, rodents, birds, predators, and parasitoids. And this is a really important one. So biological control is that Bacillus thuringiensis, which you use to treat grubs in your lawn. It does not work on sawfly larvae, which is really why it's really important to know that it's a sawfly larvae, not a caterpillar, because BT works on caterpillars, but it doesn't on sawfly larvae. You're just wasting your time and your money. Some low-risk chemical options are insecticidal soap and horticultural oil. And as has been stated many times, these are contact insecticides. So if you do not actually spray the insect itself, it will not work. There's not a very long residual, and so it really have to spray it on it. With these is very great because they're all kind of feeding together, so that's really helpful. There are some other contact which are higher risk and some systemic things, but again, with sawflies, unless you're dealing with some pine trees, it's probably not necessary and not recommended. So with that, we've talked about 9 different pests on ornamentals today. We had Betty talked about aphid scales and spider mites. Mary talked about lace bugs, iris borers, and lily leaf beetles. And I gave you some information about bagworms, Japanese beetles, and sawflies. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to do a plug for our one next month. So we gave you a little kind of taste of that. We talked about some beneficial insects. Here's what we're going to talk about next month, all those beneficial insects to look for in your garden. We'll give you more information on them. If you would take a minute, scan this QR code with your phone, and I'll put the link in the chat in just a minute so that you can just tell us what you think of the program and who you are and where you're coming from to help us to continue to provide high quality programs for all of you.